All right, so today we're talking about the squat. So first of all, if you don't know me already, my name's Alex Chow. I'm a physiotherapist and certified strength and conditioning specialist at Foundation Physio. So a bit about me. Um, I went to Queen's University for a kin degree, so this was back in 2013. And then I went to Western for my physiotherapy degree. I'm certified with FMS and SFMA, and really they're just it's a different certification for pretty much movement-based training and exercise. So they're just different certifications that you might come across. I've been pretty much exercising since 2005. Now, some of you can do the math and figure out pretty much how old I am, but it's been for a good while now. And if you know me well enough, you know that I like to dance on the side. And I put a picture of me to show pretty much what I look like without the quarantine hair, just to show what I looked like back then and before I figured out how to recycle. So those are all my egg cartons back in university, back when Rocky was a thing. Okay, so the goals for today, we're gonna cover a bunch of different topics, but really when you leave the webinar today, I want you to have a good understanding of what makes a good versus a bad squat. And really, I want you to be able to find what your optimal squat style or position is, because there are many different ways to do the squat, and really not everyone is going to be perfect for every individual. Really, it's going to be individual to you. So really, we're going to break down the squat and really troubleshoot a lot of issues that might pop up for a lot of people. And really, by the end, I want everyone to squat like a champ and really own the squat and feel comfortable and confident in doing it. And just a heads up, I put a bunch of memes in throughout the presentation, so be prepared for a bunch of memes. I hope you like memes as much as I do. Special thanks to a bunch of people that helped put this presentation together. I drew a lot of content from different strength coaches in the field and different researchers, as well as the FMS, SFMA, Dean Somerset, Brad Schoenfeld, Stu McGill, Tony Gentlecore, so really smart people from the field. Okay, so let's talk about why we want to squat. The squat is pretty much regarded by a lot of people as the king of all exercises. There are other big movements too that are really important, like lunges, deadlifts, but the squat is considered one of the top exercises because of many reasons. First off, it's really functional. So think about all the times throughout the day in which you need to squat, whether it's getting out of a chair, going up and down stairs, picking things up. Really, it's a fundamental movement that everybody does throughout the day without even realizing. And if you consider as you get older, with falls being so prevalent, squats are probably one of the best exercises to help mitigate falls because it's such a good strengthening exercise in terms of building muscle strength through your quads, hamstrings, core. In terms of bone mass density, squats are one of the best exercises to actually help improve your bone density. So think of your clients who have osteoporosis, right? Your elderly population. If you're a runner and you have stress fractures, right? Squats is probably one of the best exercises to help improve your bone density. From a cardio standpoint, it's a great cardio exercise, even it's mostly regarded as a strength exercise. In terms of stressing your metabolic system, so I think for people who want to lose weight, right, the squat works over 200 muscles in the body versus, like, imagine doing any other exercise. You're not going to work nearly as many muscles with just one exercise. And for improving overall athleticism, it's one of the best exercises for carryover into sports. So think running, jumping, sprinting. And in terms of injury prevention and rehab, one of the best injury prevention or rehab exercises. So it's one of the exercises we coach a lot and teach a lot at the clinic. So I thought I'd throw in this picture because the squat, it's one of the movements we do so often throughout the day. And one of the things I've noticed is that when people can't actually squat to pick something up, they tend to use their back more or compensate their movement in a way where they're less efficient. And over time, that can potentially be one of the reasons why people end up hurting, let's say, their back. Okay, so let's talk about what makes a bad squat. I just looked up pretty much bad squat in Google and I found a bunch of pictures, right? The reason why I did that is because you'll see many examples throughout the internet of people just doing it poorly, right? So if we look at the picture on the left, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but this girl here, she has a rounded back, right? If you look at this guy here, he's squatting a lot of weights, but if you just look from his feet all the way up his chain, you can tell that it just structurally doesn't look strong, right? And he's clearly having a hard time. And really, if you're going to be lifting that much weight, you want to make sure that your form is good. That way you're not going to get injured, right? Same thing with the guy here. You can tell the weight's about to fall, and really he's just not in a strong structural position. So I put up a bunch of squat fails because who doesn't like watching fail videos? So first things first, when you're doing your squats, always safety.
Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit.
Okay, last one, I promise. Really, I could watch these all day, but really I post them because there are so many examples of people doing the squat incorrectly, where either A, they're gonna get injured, or B, they're not actually getting the full benefit of the exercise, as in they're not using full range of motion and they're not recruiting all the right muscles, right? So what actually makes a good squat, right? If you look at the two pictures, the things we want to look for is one, that you're keeping your spine straight. Straight as in neutral. So if you look at the baby here on the left, notice how his back is staying straight. He's not rounded or he's not hyperextending the back where there's too much of a curvature. He's getting a good depth, as in his hips are below his knees. And his knees are tracking over his toes. So when you say his knees are tracking over his toes, really you want the center of the kneecap to be in line with your second or third toe, right? So essentially the knees aren't caving in. The reason why I put up the pictures of the babies is because babies actually have a fantastic squat, and if you ever have any nieces or nephews or kids yourself, really watch how they move and watch how when they need to pick something up, they'll actually go into a deep squat, because from an efficiency standpoint and from a strength standpoint, it's such a strong position for them to get into. Whereas if you look at like most adults today, we won't go into that deep squat. Really, we'll tend to bend over and pick it up instead and use our backs, right? So I wanted to highlight that example because most people starting out can actually squat really well. So let's look at some of the common issues. Some of the common issues with the squat. So throughout this presentation, you're going to see a lot of pictures and videos of me squatting. So you guys can judge me all you want and really not feel so bad about yourselves, because I'll admit that my squat is not perfect and there are things that I'm working on myself. And a lot of the tips that we're going to go through, you can do as I go through the presentation, but you can also go back and watch the recording afterwards and follow it at a slower pace as well. So again, we talked about the rounded spine or the butt wink. Now, when you hear of the butt wink, really it's a term that's floating around in the strength and conditioning community. It's really when your butt here or your tailbone goes from being straight. So if you see on the right, the low back is straight at first, but then as you get lower, you get to a point where the butt starts to tuck under. So I kind of call it like a wink, because your butt is shifting from straight to tucked under. And then what that does is it rounds out the low back. But you notice in the picture on the left, I have a rounded upper back too. Now, when you're squatting just body weight, the butt wink isn't necessarily a bad thing because really the amount of load going through your spine is quite small. But once you start to load up that squat with more weight, so if you're doing barbell back squats or front squats or any variations, it puts a lot more strain into your low back in terms of the passive structures. So think like your discs, your ligaments, right? The vertebrae, because now your erectors are essentially the muscles along your back that stabilize the spine. Those muscles aren't going to be in an advantageous position. So biomechanically, they're not going to be as strong. They're not going to be as efficient. They're not going to be able to hold up as much weight as if you keep the low back straight. So if you're squatting with a rounded back where you're essentially your chest is caving forward, you're not going to be as strong in that position and your chance of injury is going to go up. Now, some of the things that can cause this position is actually stiffness either in the hips as well as the ankles. So if your ankles and your hips aren't moving well, your body's going to find that mobility somewhere else. And typically for a lot of people, that's going to come from their low back. So if we look at the next example, this is what we call valgus knees. Valgus is essentially when that knee is starting to cave in. So you'll see on the left, the knees are starting to come in versus on the right where the knees are tracking over the toes. So as mentioned previously, we want the middle of the knee to line up with the second or third toe. That way your knee is stacked essentially over your ankle and it's a much more stable position. Again, some of the things that can cause that valgus knee position is either weakness in the hips or tight adductors, tight groin, but then also your ankle can contribute to that as well. So if you have tight ankles and your ankle isn't able to bend forward and back, it's gonna find somewhere else to get that motion. So a lot of the times when the ankle's stiff, it forces that ankle to cave in, and then it becomes an upward chain effect where everything else is caving in as well. So the arches are super important because again, if those ankles aren't moving well, it's gonna find that stability elsewhere, right? So if you look at the top left picture, you'll notice that the tibia, which is your leg, is coming down straight, but then the feet are starting to turn out, and you'll notice that the arches are starting to collapse there, right? Now, if you look at the picture below that, what you wanna see is a nice kind of arch under that inside of that foot. Now, everyone's arch is gonna be a bit different, so it's not all gonna look the same. Again, it's gonna be very individualized, but even if you have a flatter foot, you can still try to generate some tension through the arch of that foot to create stability in through that joint. Another example of some of the issues we see, this is called a good morning squat. Essentially, it's not ideal. You'll notice in the video, I'll just play it a couple times. Essentially what's happening is the down part looks good where you sink into the squat, but notice on the way up, my hips are gonna shoot up first, right? Almost turning it into a good morning exercise or kind of like a deadlift. And then the body comes up with it, right? So typically this happens for a number of reasons. One of the issues is due to fatigue. So when you're getting tired, your body's not going to be able to coordinate that movement as well. Sometimes cueing can help, so telling someone to keep their chest up. Also because the glutes aren't extending the hip forward. So instead of the glutes driving that motion, the body's using the quad first to shoot the hips up. But then from this point, it makes it much harder to get the rest of the movement, and it's going to put a lot more pressure on your back if you're using a lot more weight. So I've been working at Foundation for about 4 years now, and what I've come to realize is a lot of people don't squat well. And again, I'll be the first to admit that my squat could be a lot better. And I'll talk through a number of reasons why I think that's the case. So where exactly did we go wrong? Well, first off, ankle injuries, I think, is probably one of the biggest factors in terms of limiting someone's squat. Personally, I've had maybe half a dozen ankle sprains on each ankle, back from just sports, riding, football, track, that were left untreated. And as a result, my ankles like super stiff, like hella stiff. So untreated injuries can lead to stiffness, weakness, things that are just kind of lingering there without actually becoming an issue until you start to do challenging movements like a squat that require full mobility, right? Footwear too. So wearing dress shoes, high heels, things that create stiffness into your ankles can contribute to that limited mobility as well.
So Alex, you're saying that Raj should not wear his Vince Carter Nike Shocks anymore.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I took those high heels from Raj too. So footwear can become really important, especially if you're working downtown. You have to wear a suit or a dress shirt and dress pants and dress shoes, right? That footwear throughout the day, where you're keeping it on for 8 to 10 hours a day, can really have an impact on how tight your ankles and your calves are, right? So you could stretch for like 3-4 minutes a day, but is that really gonna undo 8 hours of dress shoes, right? I'm not saying everyone throw out your dress shoes, but these are important considerations into like how good your mobility is gonna be. Second thing, use it or lose it, right? So think of the last time you actually squatted, right? If it wasn't 10 minutes ago before you started this presentation, then really it's gonna be tough for you to do it if you don't actually do it throughout your day, right? Now, I'm assuming most of you have watched Game of Thrones, but there's gonna be probably 1 or 2 of you in this group that hasn't seen it, but that's supposed to be a chair, right? I just figured a throne was cooler. But think of how much you sit throughout the day where you're not really challenging your body. You're not getting your hip into that deeper squat position, right? You're limited to that 90-degree position where you're not engaging any of your muscles, right? I put up the picture on the right because in other countries, right, squatting is culturally acceptable, right? You'll see people squatting out in the street instead of just sitting on a chair, right? Or sitting on the curb. So the more it can be ingrained into part of your regular day, the easier it'll be to become, or the easier it will be to maintain it throughout your life, right? Think about how much you floss or brush your teeth. Do it twice a day, every day, and it becomes ingrained into your nature, right? So hopefully by the end of this webinar, people will try to squat a little bit more so that it becomes more maintainable and easier to do throughout their lifetime, as opposed to just, oh, okay, once every 2 weeks. And then if you've never been to Japan, so the toilet on the left is a Japanese toilet, which is awesome. If you've ever gotten a chance to use it, they're amazing, right? But then if you go to some countries like China, right, you actually just see like a hole on the floor, right? So you have to go number 2. Really, your choice is to either not go and just hold it in, or actually do a deep squat to actually be able to use the toilet, right? So this is an example of where sometimes technology and innovation almost becomes a hindrance, because it's the same thing as sitting in a chair. You don't really need full mobility to actually use the toilet, right? Whereas in some countries you do, and again, it's ingrained into part of their culture that promotes mobility and strength. I'm not saying everyone go dig a hole and poop in a hole, right? But just, again, if you're squatting regularly, it's gonna be easier to maintain. So really, what's the fix, right? There are a lot of Band-Aid treatments out there. Things that really try to help fix pain or knee problems, hip issues, ankle issues, right? You can use braces, go buy a TENS machine, right? The picture on the right, it's called a squatty potty, right? So it's just this little stool that someone invented, who's now super rich, and I'm pretty envious of him. But pretty much that stool is meant to mimic a squat, because your body is actually meant to squat, right? And then they've done studies to show that, yeah, it's actually more efficient for your body to poop when you're in a squat position. So instead of squatting, we're gonna make it seem like you're squatting, right? But really the real fix is to figure out, if you can't squat properly, why can't you squat, right? Because if you were born like this brand new car out of the lot and you're running perfect, you're running smooth, and you're squatting like butt to floor, why can't you do that now, right? So instead of getting all these Band-Aid treatments, let's try to figure out why you can't do it, work on those issues, and then have a goal to work towards. So once you can start to actually move a lot better, do it more, right? I don't know if you can see that, but yeah. Okay. So there's one important thing I want to talk about first before we actually talk about the squats, and that's really individual variation in terms of the anatomy, right? So everybody is different, kind of like how you have a unique thumbprint, I forget what that's called, but everybody's essentially different, right? Your your hip is no different, right? So your pelvis, your sacrum, your femur, your leg, your anatomy is going to be different from everyone else. So if we look at the structure of the hip, right, the thing I want to draw your attention to is actually what's called the acetabulum. So your hip is made up of a ball and socket joint, in which the sockets, you have one, again, essentially on each side of your pelvis. Now that ball and socket joint is gonna make that's where you get your movement from, right? So you get essentially 360 degrees of motion where you're able to lift your leg up to the side, you're able to rotate. Now, depending on the structure of that hip, you're gonna be more mobile in certain positions, right? So if we look at the bottom left picture, you'll notice the pelvis on the left, the acetabulum or the hip sockets are facing a little bit more in the front, whereas the one to the side, to the right of that, is going to be facing more a bit to the side, right? Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you'll notice the pelvis on the left, that socket's going to be facing a little bit more down and in front, versus the one on the right that's facing more to the side. Now, if you think about which one's going to help you get deeper into that squat, right? It's likely going to be the one on the left where the hip socket's a little bit more forward versus the one on the back. So already, depending on your genetics and the structure of your hip socket, it's going to dictate how deep you can squat and the position in which you keep your feet. Now, this is a picture of essentially, just going to move that to the side. I showed a couple of pictures of essentially your femur. Your femur is essentially your leg bone for your thigh. Now, your femur, again, that's going to make up the ball part of that ball and socket joint. So it's going to sit that head here into that socket, and that's how you get that motion, right? So even with the femur, you'll see that everyone's femur is different in terms of the size of the ball, the neck. Some are gonna be a little bit longer, some are gonna be a little bit thicker, and even just the angle of the orientation in which it comes out is gonna be a little bit different. Now, this is a study that was done in a population in India, and essentially what they did, so if I go back to the last picture, so if you look at the picture on the top left, that's essentially showing they call it the femoral neck angle, and really it's the angle in which the neck is going to come out of that head of that socket. So everyone's angle is going to be a little bit different. And then really, if you look at the graph on the bottom, in that study sample, they found a huge range where some people had less than 0 degrees to upwards to 20 degrees, right? And then on average, both males and females showed a discrepancy in size. So this is where you'll get some people that come in and they do a squat and you're like, hey, I'm having trouble keeping both of my feet straight. For some reason, I like to turn my left foot out and then it makes my squat feel so much better. But then how come I don't have to turn my right foot out? Now it's uneven. Do I have to be perfectly symmetrical? So they've actually done research to show that not everyone's going to be perfectly symmetrical, and symmetry sometimes isn't the answer. It's okay if you're squatting and, okay, one foot's a bit more turned out, or one hip's a bit more turned out, one foot's a bit straighter, right? Really, that asymmetry is okay. So your goal when you're doing a squat, even though, yes, it's always nicer when it's symmetrical, unless it's like a huge obvious shift that shouldn't be there. it is okay to have some deviation from left to right. So this is talking about that femoral neck angle I was talking about. So on the top picture, that's showing where it's quote unquote considered normal, right? So someone with, they call it a femoral anteversion. If it's too anteverted, right, it's gonna feel a little bit more comfortable to turn the toe in. But then for someone with more retroverted hips, so that's where we were talking about when that hip socket is a little bit more back instead of being in front, it's gonna make it a lot more comfortable for your hips if you turned your foot out. That way you're not getting any excessive pinching in through the hip. So really, in terms of figuring out which one you are, it's gonna be almost like trial and error, figuring out what works best for your body. So if someone comes up to you and says, hey, you should be squatting with your feet straight. If you don't squat with your feet straight, you're a loser, right? Really, that doesn't apply to everyone, and not everyone is gonna squat the same. So the key takeaway is pretty much you're special, you're individual, everyone's different. So you might hear a lot of things out there in terms of what's optimal or ideal or structurally sound. The key takeaway is find what works for you. And really, it's going to take a lot of experimenting. So think of when you go to the optometrist. I was about to say eye doctor, but then it clicked and I figured optometrist sounded smarter. But you're going to have to experiment, right? So when you go to the optometrist, you're checking your vision, you're looking at that board. They're going to change a couple of different degrees in terms of the lens, and they're going to say better or worse. Is that better or worse? Is that better or worse? Same thing with your squat. When you're trying to figure out, okay, what's my optimal squat position? Play around with what feels better, what feels worse, right? Does it pinch at the hip more? Does it pinch at the knee more? Does that hurt your back, right? Figure out what works best for you, and then that's gonna be your position. So I put up these pictures so that you can show that there's a bunch of individual variation in terms of how someone's gonna look when they squat, right? So I don't expect everyone to be able to squat ass to grass, butt to the floor, right? Because for some people, their anatomy might not allow that, and they might be creating more problems if they try to achieve a goal that's unattainable. Okay. So let's talk about finding your hip position, right? So all of these tests you can do, I pretty much did on myself, and I just filmed it, right? With a camera in front. So you can either do it in front of a mirror, or you can just set up a phone and film yourself, and you can pretty much get a good idea of what's gonna work for you. So in terms of figuring out likely whether your hip's gonna be a bit more retroverted or anteverted, or what type of position it's gonna like, all you have to do is sit on a chair and then rotate your foot either up or rotate it out to the side. So you notice the two pictures on the left, I'm testing my external rotation. So you can tell that my left hip externally rotates better than my right hip. But if you look at the picture on the right, my internal rotation is pretty bad, right? It's pretty bad on both sides. And comparably, my external rotation is much better on my left and my right hip. So naturally, for me, I like to squat with my hips a little bit wider, with my feet a little bit turned out, because that just helps open up my hips a lot better, as opposed to if I were to keep my feet a little bit more straight and a little bit more, my stance a little bit more narrow, just because I have less space in my hip to do that. So after that, I like to do two different tests. So the video on the left is gonna show a hip scour test. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm bringing my knee to my chest, and now I'm rotating it out to the side. Essentially, you want to think about bringing it as far up as you can without creating any pain in your hip, and then kind of scouring it through that top of that motion, and then figuring out, okay, what's the angle in which my hip gets the most amount of range of motion? So you'll notice for me, when I bring it straight up, I kind of hit a wall right in through there. And then as I bring it out to the side, I just get a little bit extra more range into my hip flexion. So that's when I open my hip up a little bit. Now if I go extra wide, notice as I bring my leg out there, it starts to get really tight in through that front of that hip socket again. And then that forces me to bring the hip down, right? So I'm not gonna be squatting with a super wide stance, but I'm also not gonna be squatting with a super narrow stance. I'm somewhere in between. And really, I just showed one side, but you're gonna be doing that for both sides. Some bachata music in there for you bachata lovers. So in the second video, it's called a hip rock back test, right? I'm essentially doing the same thing, except it's gonna be in a position that more mimics the squat. And I'm just playing around with different positions, right? So I'm starting first off with the hip a little bit more narrow. And really what I'm looking for, again, how does it feel in through that front of that hip? Does it feel tight? Does it feel stiff? Does it pinch? But then also what I'm looking for is there a point where my back starts to round a lot, right? Because then really you're at the end point of your hip flexion. So your hip is no longer bending, and now you're getting some of that movement for your back, right? So you want to look at how comfortable does that position feel, but also are you getting to a point where your back is starting to round, because we don't want that butt wink to happen if we're loading that squat. And really you're finding that position that is the most comfortable for you, in which you can get the furthest without that back rounding. So in terms of depth, right? Depth is gonna differ for a lot of people. Oops. I don't think you can see the text on the left, but in terms of quad development, they've done studies to show that squatting to 90 degrees is gonna get you the most amount of activation through that quad. And really you don't get significantly more activation when you go lower than 90 degrees. So if your goal is to get stronger quads, 90 degrees is sufficient. Now for your glutes, typically lower is better, because if you're getting more hip flexion, then the amount your glute max is gonna have to stabilize that moment is gonna be a lot more, right? So pretty much if you wanna develop the glutes a bit more, you wanna squat as low as you can without that significant butt wink. So just for those working either with injuries, through injuries, they've done studies as well looking at shear force. So shear force is essentially if you had two structures, right? The amount of force that's going to pretty much side to side, or translating force. So for the knee, you essentially have, so two bones, right? So the top bone is going to be your femur, your leg. The bottom bone is going to be your tibia, right? The ligaments that hold those together are going to be your ACL and PCL. So it prevents that forward and back motion, right? So they've done studies to show that the peak amount of shear force on the PCL is going to be at about 90 degrees. For the ACL, it's going to be from 15 to 30 degrees, right? So for all those people that are saying, oh yeah, you can't squat deep because it's going to hurt your ACL, right? That's completely false, because as you squat deeper, the amount of shear force actually becomes less, right? But the thing you want to keep in mind, the lower you go with that squat, you're going to get more compressive forces. So compressive force, instead of going front to back, it's going to be pretty much stacked on top of each other, right? Now that has implications for putting a bit more pressure on your meniscus and your cartilage. Now, all of these considerations, if you have a healthy knee, really your knee is strong enough to withstand all those forces. Even if you're squatting like 2-3 times body weight, your body is gonna adapt to that load, and it can actually help strengthen your ACL, your PCL, your meniscus, your cartilage, your muscles, right? To actually be able to tolerate that load. The reason why I put those points out there is because if you currently have a knee injury, or if you're working with a special population that does have an injury, these are important considerations to keep in mind. So if someone fresh off of like a meniscus repair, you're not gonna want them squatting ass to grass, right? Okay, so finding your squat position. As we talked about earlier, it's gonna be different for everyone, right? A really easy cue or instruction I give to people is just jump as high as you can. your body's naturally going to set up in that position in which it feels the strongest. And more often than not, that's going to be pretty much where they're going to be most comfortable, right? Typically, you do want a little bit of external rotation of the foot. So you don't want it to actually be super straight. Anywhere from 5 to 30 degrees in the literature has been considered normal. And really, you're not going to get a difference in terms of muscle activation when you're rotating the foot out. There are some studies that show that, yeah, you're going to get a bit more contribution through either the glutes or the adductors, right? But overall, it's not going to make a huge impact in terms of the foot rotation. So in terms of stance width, again, this is going to be different for everyone. Typically for people, it's going to be shoulder width or slightly wider. But again, the key takeaway is try a bunch of different positions, test, retest, what feels better, what feels worse, find what works for you. Now, if you're going to go wider or if you're going to squat wider, you're going to have improved activation through your glute max, your hamstrings, and your adductors, right? So you're working just different muscle groups. Again, for those dealing with injuries to the knee or knee pain, it is going to create a little bit more compression at the knee, right? Versus if you were to squat with a narrow stance. But if you're squatting with a narrow stance, it is going to force you to bend a little bit more through that knee. So you are going to get a little bit more shear force. So depending on the type of injury you have, it might be useful early on to play around with the squat stance in terms of the width to find something that's more comfortable for you. Because one position might give you a little bit more pain, one position might give you a little bit less pain. Now, they've also done studies to look at your gaze, right? Which I thought is super interesting. So actually where you look is going to influence some of the mechanics in your squat. So in terms of where to look, you should just be looking straight forward, right? They did studies looking at different gazes, and they found that in this one population, if you do look down, it is going to flex your spine and your hip a little bit more. So the chance of you getting either that butt wink is going to be slightly higher. And again, this isn't going to be the case for everyone, but I think keeping a neutral gaze is going to be safer.
Alex, did they talk at all about looking up towards the ceiling while you squatted?
Yeah, they found no difference. So they did 3 populations. One was looking straight forward, one was looking a little bit up, one was looking down. There was no difference in the looking straight and looking up position compared to looking down. But really, if you're going to be squatting and you have a bar in your back, I don't want to be in this position, right? Because that's going to really tighten up the neck, if anything. And you want to try to keep that neck as straight as possible, right? So when in doubt, just keep that gaze forward and keep that head straight without actually looking down. Okay, so troubleshooting the squat. If you guys want, you can try just doing a couple quick reps of the squat and then seeing how it feels. Again, really we're looking for that straight spine. We want that hip to be at 90 degrees or a little bit below, and we want that knee to track over the toe. And if you can't get into that position and you've already played around with different stance widths, foot position, and you still can't get there, these are some ways to figure out why that might be happening, and it might highlight some imbalances that you can work on at home. Okay, so mobility first, right? If there's one thing that we want to address first is to make sure that you actually have that flexibility to get into that deep squat. I put a picture of Drake because my hair is starting to look like his. That's what I'm going for at this point. And really we're gonna start from the bottom, right? So we want to look at the ankle, hip, thoracic spine in that order. So this mobility screen is something that the FMS just came up with, and they've done a couple studies on it to show that it was actually a valid and reliable test, meaning if you were to do the test and if different practitioners were to do that test, if they follow the criteria that they're looking at, it's going to give you pretty valid results. And it's going to be reliable every time you do it. But then if other people were to do it on you, you get pretty good results as well. So in terms of how much ankle mobility you have, so we're talking about dorsiflexion or DF. Dorsiflexion is essentially how much your tibia or your lower leg can actually bend over that foot. So we're measuring that ankle mobility. Now, when they've done biomechanical analyses of the squat, you actually need anywhere from, and again, there's going to be variation in people. So if you have more ankle mobility, you're going to need less hip mobility. But if you have more hip mobility, it can compensate for less ankle mobility. But on average, you're going to want close to 40 degrees. In this one study, they found that on average, you need about 39 degrees, but there's a range, so plus or minus 6. So really anywhere from 33 to upwards of 45, right? Now, in this study that they did with the FMS, essentially what you're doing is you're keeping your feet stacked, right? So essentially the back foot is the foot that or the ankle you're measuring. Now that toe is gonna touch that heel, and really you're bending that back leg as far as it can without that heel coming off. Now there's a bone in the front leg called your malleolus, and that's really the bump that sticks out on the inside of your foot. Really, to get a good score, you want that back knee to be able to pass that line. So where that malleolus or that bone on the front is, if you create an imaginary line going up, your back knee should be able to pass that. Now, I forgot to put in the study, but they did a study that showed that for people who are able to pass that line, you're essentially at 40 degrees of dorsiflexion. And anywhere below that line, you're in a range, but typically for the majority of people, they were under 40 degrees. So really, we want to be striving for the picture on the right where you're actually able to pass that line. So here's a video of me doing it. Now some special considerations. So you can't see the arch position on my back foot, right? You can see it in the front foot, but notice how I'm keeping an elevated arch throughout my foot the entire time. Because for some people, it's gonna be a lot easier to collapse through that arch so they get essentially more range of motion, but really you're compromising the stability of your foot at that point, and it no longer becomes a valid test. So you can't see that on my back foot, but I'm essentially trying to do the same thing. So that's about the point I get to before my heel is starting to come off the mat. So if I draw a line down, I'm essentially a couple centimeters below. So my ankle definitely needs a little bit more work, right? So this is a test that you can do at home, and you can kind of just visualize, okay, am I getting past that bone in through the front there? And it's a pretty prominent bone, so all of you should be able to find it. Okay. This is a cool study that they did. So they got a bunch of experienced lifters, so people who are squatting already and are pretty comfortable with the squat. And then they made essentially two study groups. The first group on the left, so the A group, they got them to squat pretty much unrestricted. So they're essentially like, hey, do your squat, just do it how you normally would, right? In the population B, they put a board that blocks the front of their knee from passing their toe. So you might have all heard, oh yeah, don't squat with your knees past your toes. Your kneecap's gonna explode and then you're gonna need surgery, right? So when in the unrestricted group, so they actually measured the amount of torque going in through your knee, and they found it was 150 newtons, right? And then they also measured the amount of hip torque, so essentially how hard your hip is working, and that was about 28 newtons. Now in the group that had to block their knee from going forward, they found that it did actually reduce the amount of stress on the knee, right? But then they found a greater than tenfold increase on the amount of torque in through your hip. And even just looking at the two pictures, you'll notice the guy on the right, he's having a much harder time actually maintaining that neutral position in which he's staying upright. And he has to lean a little bit more forward because now his ankle can't bend as much. So it's forcing him to bend more through his hip and more through his back to maintain that center of gravity over his feet, right? So sure, if you're having knee pain, it is a good strategy to not let your knee go too far forward. It will reduce some of that stress on that knee, but pay attention to the compromise. So if your knee's not doing as much work, your hip has to do a little bit more to compensate. So make sure you're not putting yourself in a position that can lead to an injury elsewhere, AKA your low back. So what do you do if you have tight ankles? So I'm gonna go through some quick and easy things that you can do if you do this test and you're like, okay, my ankles are a little bit tight. Here are some of the things that I can do. So I first start off with a bit of foam rolling.
And as you can see right now, both of them unfortunately.
Right, so any foam roller works. There are different ways to do it. You can even use a lacrosse ball if you want a little bit more pressure. I personally like the foam roller because it covers more area in a quicker time. Now notice how I turn my foot out there. So for a lot of people, foam rolling your calves is the go-to because your calves are gonna be directly behind that leg, and it's gonna be one of the factors that limits your dorsiflexion, right? One of the muscle groups that people don't often consider are your peroneals. So your peroneals are on the outside of that leg. So there's two muscles that run from the knee and actually cross the ankle and attach into the foot. So if your peroneals are tight too, that can limit your mobility. So yes, foam roll the back of your calves, but then you also want to turn that foot out so you're actually getting the side of that leg too, because tight peroneals can limit that dorsiflexion as well. So I typically do both. And this is a sped up version. Typically I'll go a little bit slower and I'll spend a bit more time on it, usually about 3 to 5 minutes. So then once you foam roll, typically I'll start with the foam rolling because that's gonna loosen up the muscles, get some blood flowing first. And then I'll go into some active stretching. So again, some special considerations. Notice how I'm creating that arch in my foot so that I get a better stretch in through my ankle and I'm not collapsing through that midfoot to try to get a little bit more mobility. And essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm actually using that treadmill, but you can use anything, right? You can use a wall for more support. And I'm actually pushing really hard into that treadmill and I'm driving my heel and my foot down into the floor. It's okay if your heel lifts off a little bit, but the intention is to get your knee as far forward as you can without that arch collapsing or that knee twisting in. And really you can feel a stretch anywhere in through the ankle joint itself or up along that calf or along those peroneals we talked about on that outside of that leg. And sometimes if you need a little bit more assistance, essentially what you can do is if you have something strong, you can tie a band around a pole and just put it in through that lower leg so that you actually get a little bit extra pull in through that ankle to help get a deeper stretch. So it's essentially the same stretch, but I'm just using that band for a little bit more leverage. Okay, so just because your ankles are tight doesn't mean you can't squat. So for me, my squat improves significantly once I add a heel lift. So you might have heard people say, oh yeah, just add a heel lift, add a heel lift. Essentially what that's doing is it's making essentially it's putting your foot in a bit more plantar flexion. That way you can get a little bit more range through your ankle before it starts to tighten up. And really the goal is you want to be able to maintain more of an upright position because now your center of mass is a little bit more forward and you no longer have to sit in through the back of the hip a little bit more. So if you compare my squat on the left where I'm not using a heel lift, notice how I have to maintain more of that trunk lean forward, which puts a lot more pressure into my hip and my back versus when I'm squatting with something under my heel. And really, you can use anything that's a little bit sturdy. And in the picture, I'm using just a couple of folded towels. But you can use either some weight plates, you can use a small book. Okay, so hip mobility. Again, in that same study that looked at how much mobility people typically get when they're doing that squat, you need at least 95, but again, it's gonna be a range depending on the person. If anything, you probably want a little bit more, so closer to like 120, 125. That way you're not just hitting a wall once you hit 95, and it's like a hard stop, right? You always want to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room. That way you're actually moving a little bit more freely, right? And we all know that hip flexion, or bringing your knee to your chest, you have way more than, or at least for most people, you have way more than 95 degrees, right? But for some populations, let's say if you have hip OA, you're a little bit older, your hip's a little bit tighter, sometimes you don't need your knee to be able to touch your chest to be able to squat properly. And again, when you do your hip scour test, you're gonna figure out how much hip mobility you have and whether you can pretty much get to that point. So what do you do if your hips are tight? Stretch, obviously, strengthen. So I'm just gonna pull up a couple of videos looking at ways to improve your hip mobility. So first one's a pigeon stretch. Again, for someone with really anteverted hips, in which they have way more internal rotation than external rotation, this stretch might not be your stretch, right? Because really, I'm forcing my hip into a lot of external rotation because that's what feels more comfortable for my hip, and also into that deep flexion, right? So if you do this stretch and you're like, hey, why does it really pinch in through the front of my hip, right? I'm not really feeling that stretch through my glutes or the back of my hip. This stretch might not be the one for you. So the stretch on the right, really I'm using that box to elevate my foot. That way I can get into a deeper stretch. And really I'm working on hip flexion at that point. So I'm trying to work on getting my knee as close to my chest as I can. And then from there, I'm creating some hip circles to try to create just a bit of rotation in through my hip. Okay, the video on the left is butterfly stretch. Again, it's going to be a position that resembles a squat pretty closely. Essentially, I'm trying to get a little bit more abduction, so being able to get my hips a little bit wider. And I'm trying to sink essentially my hip to my feet, and then trying to keep my low back as straight as I can. That way I get a deeper stretch in through that hip. And then the video on the right, so if you checked out Ryan's webinar a couple weeks ago, he did a great webinar on locking the hips, right? So we talked about some FRC principles, so functional range conditioning. So yeah, it's good if you're doing a lot of stretching, but if you don't have that strength to work those muscles in that range of motion you have, the chances of you maintaining that mobility is gonna be a lot harder, and you're gonna have to stretch a lot more without making as much progress, right? So if you wanna learn, this is just one example, but if you wanna get some more examples of some ways to actually strengthen your hip through that range, you can check out one of our other webinars on FRC. This is just an example where I'm actually trying to lift my leg up and then swing it all the way around. So I'm strengthening my glutes as well as my hip flexors in an end range position. And you can see how much I struggle there because I suck at these, and really I don't do them often enough. But it's another strategy you can use if you find that your hips are really tight or weak. Okay, thoracic spine. Once you've got your ankles done, your hips done, this is probably the last place I'll go to. And I'll typically work in that order because your ankle and your hip mobility is gonna dictate a lot of how your squat looks. So this test is called a lumbar locked. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm getting my heels or my butt to my heels, and essentially that's gonna lock out my lumbar spine because the rotation I wanna check is through my thorax or my thoracic spine. Because you wanna think of keeping your low back stable and strong but getting that flexibility and that mobility through your upper back. And then what I'm essentially doing is I'm rotating up without shifting through my hips or my low back. And this is going to give you an idea of how much rotation you're getting in through your thoracic spine. So a good view to see how much you have is to actually look from the front. And essentially what we're looking at is, okay, what's the angle from shoulder or from one of your shoulders to the other? Now you want to make sure you're not overly extending through that shoulder joint. So really you're looking at the line from your clavicle, which is like your collarbone, in terms of getting that accurate measure of how much rotation you're getting. So this one you might need to set a camera up in the front to film, or you can have, if you're quarantining with someone right now, you can have them give you a view and tell you if it's good or not. So essentially what we're looking at is the angle from parallel to the floor. What angle do you get? So the one on the left is a much better example of, compared to the one on the right. Typically you want, in terms of what like a good normal value is, you want close to around 60 degrees. You don't need a full 60 degrees to be able to stay upright in a squat, because really this test is looking at both your extension and rotation. Because the squat's a bilateral movement and you're just upright in one plane, you don't need as much rotation, it's more extension. But this test will give you a good indication of whether your back is actually stiff or not. So what do you do if you do this test and you're like, yeah, I have a really hard time getting that extension and that rotation, and even just like as you do that squat, you're still hunched over. So foam rolling first, because that's going to help loosen up, again, a lot of the muscles in through the back, as well as get some blood flowing. Now, when you foam roll, I focus the foam rolling to the upper and middle back. So think your thorax. That's where your rib cage is. It's going to be perfectly safe, and the chances of you injuring yourself is like negligible. Where I don't foam roll is my low back. If anything, your low back probably moves well enough, and you don't need to give it that extra mobility. And if anything, you might injure your low back. So after foam rolling, a great stretch are just cat camels, right? So I stole this from the yogis. Great stretch if you want to improve just overall range of motion in terms of flexion and extension. And then the one on the left, this one's nice because then you're actually getting some hip flexion. So you're doing the rotation in a lunge position. So it's going to be in a position that's more resembling that squat position. So you're getting some hip flexion, but you're also getting some rotation as well. And then the video on the right, this one's nice because then they call it an open book or a windmill, but you're, again, getting that extension and that rotation. And this one's nice because you actually have gravity to help you in terms of getting that rotation. And I'm keeping my knees stacked, and I'm trying to keep essentially my knees down, so I'm getting the rotation through my upper back. Okay, so once you have your mobility checked and you're already working on improving your mobility, once your mobility starts to improve, and even before that, right, when you squat, you can be the most flexible person in the world, but if you don't have any sense of generating tension into your body or utilizing those muscles in a way that creates stability through your core and your legs and your feet, your squat's going to look like jello, right? It's not going to be stable. It's not going to be strong. So if you have the mobility to do it, great, but make sure you're doing it properly. You're engaging the right muscles. Okay, so these are 3 examples of me squatting. The video on the left is me squatting just normally. So notice what happens when I get to the bottom. Again, we've already established that I have crappy ankles, so that's going to be the first thing I'm going to fix. If But notice as I get to the bottom, I'm no longer able to actually keep my chest upright. So the ability of my back to stabilize that motion could be a lot better. Now, as soon as I stick my hands out and now I have a bit of a counterbalance, my squat cleans up a lot more. I still get some of that low back rounding, so that butt winking at the bottom. But already by balancing out your weight, by keeping your hands in front, it creates a lot of stability in through my core, and I'm able to squat a little bit lower without leaning forward. So the video on the right is a goblet squat. So that's when I hold a weight in front of me. And you'll notice that cleans up a lot of my form, in which I'm able to actually engage my erectors a lot better. And I'm able to sit into that squat while keeping my low back straight. So if you compare the right video to my left one, right? Sometimes all you need is just a weight in front so that your muscles can actually engage and hold that position. And it just shifts your center of gravity a little bit more forward so that you can actually squat a little bit deeper without your low back rounding. Okay, again, we're gonna start with our feet in terms of how to create tension through your body so you have a better squat. So think of your foot as a tripod. So your 3 points of contact are your heel, your big toe, and your little toe. And really, the goal is to keep your weight evenly distributed through those points of contact, essentially through the center of your foot. So in terms of creating tension in through your feet, essentially what we're looking for, so again, bringing back those pictures in which what a bad arch versus a good arch looks like. What I tell people to do and what I do myself is I think of 2 things. So with my feet, I want to grip the floor, right? But I don't want to do it to a point where my big toe actually curls up and I lift off the floor. And then second thing, I try to spread my feet apart as much as I can. So I call it the grip and rip. So you can try this with a towel underneath your feet. In this video here, I have a mat. And essentially what I'm thinking of doing is I'm gripping the mat, but I'm also trying to rip that mat apart as hard as I can. And when you do that and you keep those 3 points of contact and you keep that stable foot and you try to rip that mat apart or the floor, you're gonna notice that it activates your arch stabilizers. So your arches are essentially gonna light up. But notice how it also rotates my knee out so that it's stacked over the middle of my toes. So that creates stability, one, in through my arches, but also up the chain in through my knee and my hip. So when you create that stability into your arches, you're gonna notice it really cleans out that alignment. And that's gonna create a lot of tension into your hips because now your hips are externally rotating and you're actually activating the muscles in through your hips to create that stability. So you're gonna create a chain effect starting all the way from your feet up to the hips. A good way to practice this is by adding a band around the knees or either below the knees or above the knees, because that's gonna give you some resistance to push against. And I find that the activation is gonna be a lot better in through the glutes. Okay, the last thing, creating tension through your core. So the video on the left, essentially what I'm doing is I'm using that treadmill, but you can use anything you have at home, like a door, a couch, a table, something that's sturdy. And I'm using that object to help me lower into that squat. Now, as I get into that deep squat position, I let go, and then I try to squat up. I try to squat up without having that assistance. So I'm squatting down with assistance, I let go, and then I come back up. The key is when you do this, you want to maintain that same hip and spine position when you let go as you come up. So in the second example, I'm using that same goblet squat, but to make it harder, now I'm putting the weight down, hands to chest, and then I'm maintaining that position. So essentially what you're doing is you're working on that bottom position, teaching your body and your core how to create stability in that position so you don't need that counterbalance to help you in that deep position. If you want to make it a little bit tougher, right? So I'm still using a weight in front, but what I'm going to do is I'm adding a bit of rotation as well in through my thoracic spine. So you can make it a little bit tougher and work on your mobility as well. And there are a bunch of different variations that you can do to make your squat either better or make it a little bit more challenging. These are just some examples that you can work through. If it's still too hard, you can sink into that squat with assistance, but also come back up with assistance. So you don't have to let go at first. The key is to squat to the range that you can comfortably get to, and then squat back up with good form. And there's nothing wrong with combining everything we've talked about. So for me, my best squat is when I have a heel lift, a band around my knees, and a weight in front to counterbalance. So I'm using all the principles we talked about today to make it easier on my ankles, to give me some stability through my glutes and my hips, but then also using a weight in front to counterbalance so that I'm really using all these tools to create stability in through my squat. Now, I have a couple of exercises that
AC?
Yeah.
Sorry, buddy, I'm just going to cut you off for a second. We're heading towards the end of our time, our allotted time. Do you want to kind of quickly maybe just talk about some of these, and then that way we can get to a couple of the questions as well?
Sure. So these exercises you've seen before, I'm just doing a couple of exercises to help strengthen your core if you find that it's one of your weak areas. So bridges, side planks, all great exercises to help strengthen your core if you find that you're moving well, but your core is more of the issue. So once you pretty much check off all those boxes, pretty much the sky's the limit. And there are so many different variations of squats that you can do. And really it's just a matter of doing it more and loading it more. For those of you that already squat well, there are a couple examples of like front squat, high bar squat, low bar squat. For a rehab population, the front squat, it seems to be the best one in terms of reducing the amount of compression on the knees as well as the low back. It just makes it easier for you to stay upright versus either a low bar squat in which the bar is lower and a high bar squat. And then I have one video to show.
Well, there's plenty of time for that, I suppose.
How amazing the body is in terms of.
I mean, that's the best lift he's ever made in his life.
Yeah, really.
Like on an official stage.
Yeah. It equals his best clean and jerk.
So key takeaways, you're special. Find what works for you. And then move well and move often. Here are some of my references and my resources. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can follow me on Instagram or follow our foundation page, right? Message me. We're also doing virtual appointments. So if you're having issues or if something's giving you pain or you're working through injuries, we're doing virtual appointments now. So if you need that extra assistance, feel free to reach out to myself or any of us at the clinic. We'll be more than happy to help you. And thank you for enduring my extra long presentation. And I hope you got some valuable insight into the squat, and it helps a lot of you out.
That was awesome, AC. A lot of good information. I know we were getting a ton of questions coming through, and I think you actually answered most of the questions. There was a lot of questions about how deep do you need to go, how important is ass to grass technique, which I think you've addressed. You talked about some considerations for ACL injuries and other injuries like that. One good question was, are we meant to find the one good squat position we have, or should we work at different foot positions?
That's going to depend on, again, everyone. Some people are just going to have greater mobility than others. For those people that are really flexible and they can squat in whatever position they want, they have more wiggle room and can squat in multiple positions. So really that's, again, going to come down to trial and error. If you only have one good position to squat in and that's your best position, really you should be squatting in that position unless you're trying to work different muscles. So we talked about squatting with a narrower stance versus a wider stance in terms of glute activation or hamstrings or adductor activation. So if you have the mobility to do it, then you can do it. But that's not the case for everyone. And some people are going to have one position that works better for them.
Great. You also talked about, knee position over the toes. There was a lot of questions coming through about crepitus or cracking in the knees or patella dysfunction, like patella tendon dysfunction with the knees. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So that's going to be very individualized. Again, it depends on your injury history and what you're working through. Crepitus, or that cracking sound in itself, hasn't been shown to be bad, right? So you can have that cracking, and if you're not getting any knee pain, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could just be the way your anatomy is. If you're getting that cracking and it's giving you pain every time you squat and you can't bend your knee, if you're in an older population and you just had an x-ray and you have chondromalacia patella, right? CMP, and it's very severe, right? So we're looking at, you don't just want to look at the crepitus and the cracking itself and think, oh my God, I can't squat because my knee cracks. My knee cracks all the time and I don't have any pain, right? You want to do a good history and look at all the information together in terms of cracking, pain, your age, your history, so many other factors, right?
I'm going to combine two questions here. There's a question about where people should be holding a dumbbell, which I think you talked about a little bit at the end there. And then there's a great question here about the tip of pulling the bar apart when you're doing a back squat, and what does that actually mean for your form?
So there are different cues to use if you're doing a back squat. So if you're doing a back squat, really the key is to generate tension in through your lats, right? So for some people, it'll be pulling the bar apart. Some people find it's better when they externally rotate that shoulder and drive that shoulder blade down and back like this, almost like you're bending and breaking the bar. And really the goal of that is to generate tension through your lats here, because your lats actually connect all the way to your low back, right? So if you're creating that tension through your lat, it's automatically gonna make your lumbar spine stronger, because your lumbar spine is gonna be pretty much just stronger in terms of the muscles that cross through it. So the chance of you flexing through your back under the load is going to become a lot less.
Right.
I think I answered that correctly.
And we'll do one last question. There was a lot of people asking about snapping hip and what they could do for that when it comes to squatting. So
there could be, that's a tough question, because there could be a number of causes for that snapping hip, right? It could be internal, it could be structurally of the joint, something in that, actually that hip joint. It could be your hip flexor. It could be your IT band in through the side. Really, it's tough, again, because if that snapping is occurring, so many things could be causing that, whether it's a structural issue that we can't fix internally, or it could be due to muscle imbalances. So working on the imbalances you have. Sometimes it could be cleared up by working on some of the things we talked about in terms of finding your optimal hip position, because that hip might snap in one position, but all you have to do is either rotate that foot out or rotate that hip out, or find another position that's a bit more comfortable. So I would play around with that first. And really, if you're getting that consistently throughout, that's when you want to check in with your physio, because there could be so many things causing that. And it shouldn't be something that's overlooked. So it could
Awesome.
be something minor, but it could be something that's worth addressing with a professional, right? That I can't answer in minutes.
Yeah. For those of you who are asking, you will get an email from Zoom or through Zoom with a link to the recorded, entire recorded webinar on our YouTube channel for your reference. I know Alex has a bunch of these already up, a lot of the testing and exercises up on his Instagram at AC Rehab. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to answer a couple questions if you want to send him some DMs on Instagram, because the poor guy doesn't get a lot of DMs. You can also send him an email at alex@foundationphysio.com. And like he's mentioning, if you are continuing to have some issues and very specific issues like snapping hip or problems in the ankle, he's taking virtual consults right now as well.